well into the natural world. Sometimes it doesn't fit quite as well. But what I want to do is introduce the very simplest idea that we use to define a species. And we call it the biological species concept, seen here on the slide. And it just says this: a species is a population of individuals whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So if these animals that are living together can breed with each other and produce offspring that can also breed and produce offspring, then they are one species. Now this sometimes works well and sometimes doesn't work that well when we try to define a species. But this is the simplest and the most widely used idea of a species. So we would all agree that a possum and a raccoon are different species because they can't breed. They cannot breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. And so over the next couple slides, we want to talk about some of the mechanisms that prevent these animals from interbreeding. Alright, so members of a different species then, like our possums and raccoons, cannot mate with each other because they are reproductively isolated. So why does reproductive isolation occur? There are different mechanisms that cause reproductive isolation. And so here we have 7 different methods that can cause reproductive isolation. The first we have is ecological isolation. And so ecological isolation occurs when organisms simply live in different environments. So remember, we're talking about the overall topic here is reproductive isolation. Why don't organisms reproduce? And so what we're saying is there are 7 potential reasons that we commonly see in nature that prevent organisms from reproducing. Number 1, ecological isolation. And so this means that the organisms simply live in different places. And so here we have a desert fox on top, and here we have an Arctic fox on the bottom. One lives in Mexico, one lives in Arizona. One lives in Canada, the Arctic fox, and one lives in Mexico and Arizona. And so they're just not going to run into each other. So they are ecologically isolated. Could they reproduce? Maybe, but they're not going to because they do not encounter one another. What about temporal isolation? So temporal means time, or it refers to time, and temporal isolation occurs when organisms reproduce at different times. On the top here we have a leopard frog, on the bottom we have a bullfrog. These frogs aren't active quite yet in Kentucky, although if you go further south they'd be active this time of year. But interestingly, the leopard frogs breed first and the bullfrogs breed later. And so they do not, they aren't fertile at the same time. Could they reproduce? Maybe, but we'll never know because the leopard frogs are going to breed in April and the bullfrogs are going to breed in June and July. And so they don't encounter each other at the appropriate times and cannot reproduce. Behavioral isolation, perhaps the most interesting. And so behavioral isolation occurs when two animals have mating behaviors that are so different that one party doesn't recognize the mating behavior of the other species. Here's an example. So here we have blue-footed boobies. Blue-footed boobies are perhaps one of the most famous examples of mating behaviors. And so blue-footed boobies are a marine bird. And when they mate, we have the male on the left, the female on the right. The male does this dance. He wobbles back and forth. He jiggles around a little bit, and then he ends with this courting display that we see in B here that I'm pointing to with the cursor at this point. And the female looks at that and says, all right, that'll work for me. And she reproduces with that male. If the male doesn't do the dance correctly, then the female won't mate with him. And so if another species comes along, then that species has no idea what the dance is of this particular bird. And so even if they could reproduce, they're not going to because of behavioral isolation. An interesting idea. We often see it in birds. Bird songs are another example of behavioral isolation. Birds will not reproduce with one another if they do not recognize the song that's being sung by another bird. Okay. All right. Now this may be a little disturbing, but mechanical isolation. So mechanical isolation is interesting and occurs when, let's assume that these species live in the same place, they mate at the same time, they're fertile at the same time, their behaviors are okay, but they go to mate and their parts simply don't fit. So this is a very dramatic example. What you see on the screen is the penis of a possum. And so, as you can see, the possum penis is double-pronged, and the penis of a raccoon and a skunk and a fox are single-pronged. And so that, if nothing else, would prevent mating between a raccoon and a possum, because only the possum, female, has that double-pronged receptacle for that penis. And so, interestingly, mechanical isolation occurs when mating organs are incompatible. This is very common in insects. Insects often have a lock and key sort of genitalia, and so the species of one male will only fit into females of that same species. And so, interestingly, mechanical isolation, it's relatively rare in the mammal world, but very common in the insect world. But the mammal world's a little more dramatic, so I gave you that particular example. Gametic isolation. And so what happens if you live in the same place, you mate at the same time, your behaviors are okay, and your parts fit? Well, another thing that can occur is that the gametes simply don't unite. And so why can't this pug reproduce with this cat it sees on the screen, even if they want to start a family and have kids? The answer is that they can try. I don't know if they would, but they could. And if they do, then everything will go okay, but they won't form gametes. Interestingly, the gametes are so different between a dog and a cat that they do not fuse and they do not produce a zygote. And as you know, a zygote is a single-celled embryo. And so gametic isolation is another level of isolation that can occur, preventing reproduction. Hybrid inviability. And so interestingly, if you go through all the ones we've talked about so far and you actually produce an offspring, interestingly, you can be prevented. Sorry, I'm going to look at. Yeah, okay. So you can be prevented from reproducing if the zygote that you form has genes that are so incompatible that it never reaches full maturity. And so this happens between a sheep and a goat. Sheep and goats can reproduce. They can make a zygote, in other words, a single-celled embryo. That embryo can start to develop, but it spontaneously aborts before it is fully formed. And so hybrid inviability means that that hybrid that's produced never develops. It never matures. It simply becomes this entity that's spontaneously aborted. And then finally, what happens if that hybrid is viable? What happens if it's born and grows up? There's one last level of potential reproductive isolation, and that occurs if that hybrid is infertile. And so hybrid infertility occurs if you have an offspring that can actually not go out and produce fertile offspring itself. And so the best example, and most widespread example, would be a mule, like we have on the screen. And so a donkey and a horse can breed, produce an offspring that is viable. It does live, but mules cannot reproduce. And interestingly, as you may remember from earlier in our class, they cannot reproduce because they have a different number of gametes. Horses, actually I can't quite remember, but there's one off. I'm sorry, I may have misspoken there. They have a different number of chromosomes is the key, different number of chromosomes. Horses have one number, and donkeys I think have one less, but they're one off in terms of the number of chromosomes. But the bottom line is, oftentimes hybrids can be produced, but those hybrids are not fertile themselves. And so that is something that prevents horses, in this case, and donkeys from becoming one species, because mules cannot reproduce. And so the gradation, or the combination of those two species, never gets beyond that particular point. All right, and so what is speciation then? Speciation is the development of a new species in the natural world. And so we're going to wrap up this chapter with this idea. Speciation is genetic divergence, and so it typically occurs when two populations become separated for one reason or another. It doesn't have to be the case, but there's some barrier between gene flow that occurs between them. And over time, the species become more and more different in the 7 different types of reproductive isolation that we just talked about come into play. And so eventually their behaviors diverge, and even their parts, as we talked about, mechanical isolation, may become so different that they can't reproduce with one another. And at that point, all scientists would agree, yes, we have two brand new species. So we have an interesting example here on the right-hand side of our screen from our text. We have the various manatee-like organisms that are found in the world. So we have the West Indian manatee, and we talked about these on Monday, Amazonian, West African manatee, and the dugong, and then that stellar sea cow. Look how big that is. Look how small these manatees are, and that stellar sea cow, which has been extinct since the 1770s. But all of these different manatee-like organisms presumably came about because of reductions in gene flow and speciation. Speciation typically occurs in an allopatric manner, known as allopatry. And so allopatric speciation occurs. Allopatric means in different locations. So allopatric speciation occurs when, for instance, here we have South America. If I can get the pointer back, here we have it, South America. And here we have the Galapagos Islands. And so the finches blew from South America out to these islands. If we zoom in here, and some finches ended up here, some there, and the conditions on the island were different, and the finches could not fly back and forth between one island and another, and so they became gradually more and more and more different over time, developing into different species ultimately, and we refer to this as allopatry or allopatric speciation. Okay, so that concludes our Chapter 15 lecture. Remember, this is your Chapter 15 lecture. This is what we would have done on Wednesday, March the 20th. This is our Wednesday, March the 20th lecture. So we will be back in class on Monday. Everything will resume as normal, and we'll have some announcements regarding our next exam and things that are coming up in the class. If you have questions, contact me. Otherwise, I'll see you on Monday.